All right, so oftentimes, often, I have a bunch of data in a file, and I don't know how much data is in that file, right? How much data could be in that file? There could be none, there could be tons, there could be millions of entries. So how am I going to know when to stop reading from a file? Michael. When I run out, and we actually have a term for that, when we reach end of file. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? There's my loop. My loop is while not end of file. Okay? There's my loop. So we're going to look at a bunch of these, and this is a very, very common way of storing data. Okay? And it could be all the same kind of data. It could be all temperatures, or it could be names and cities and temperatures. And I need to learn how to read each of them in. Okay? And might have different variables for each one, et cetera, et cetera. All of these are totally logical ways of doing this. So let's look at the scenario for reading in from a file. Here we go. So I've showed you how to open the file. Typically on a quiz and on the homework, I don't really require you to open the file. And the reason for that is it's very language specific. This is not a language specific class. This is a concept class. Okay? In lab on Wednesday, you will have to open a file. Okay? What I'm more interested in is you being able to read all the data from that file and write an algorithm to do that. Okay? So you note the difference. Let's take a look at these two input statements. And they look very much like what input statement? The CIN. But rather than reading from the CIN, we're reading to a file that I've opened and attached to. Okay? And I could call it anything. All right? I've done that up prior in the program. Okay? Now, I could read in just one guy, or I could read in a city name followed by a temperature, okay, depending upon how the file is structured. Depending upon how the file is structured. Okay? All right, so in this particular example, the file actually has a sentinel in it. And this is not unheard of. Let me see if we can, let's hold off. It's not, I don't think anybody heard me. So let's say I have a file with a bunch of data, and I actually separate one set of data from another set of data by popping a sentinel value in there. Okay? So this particular program reads in a temperature, and it's going to keep reading until it gets to a 999. That's a sentinel. Does the conversion, who cares? Reads in the next guy. And this will read in all the temperatures in a file until it gets to 999. So that implies that there's other data after the 999. This is not the typical way of reading from a file, but you could do this. Let's look first at what's different about the input from a file as the input from a user. What's different about inputting from a file versus inputting from a user? V, no prompt. No prompt, right? When I input from a user, I always say, please enter temperature, CIN temp. Well, I don't need to prompt the file. That data's sitting there. Okay? The other thing that's different is rather than using CIN, I use the handle for the file. So it actually ends up being a simpler code design. All right, but what most of the time our file is going to look like is we're going to use a fact that when you're reading from a file, the file sends a signal that causes the loop to fail, or causes the read to fail, and we call this an end-of-file loop. And this has no trailer record. There's a couple of ways of saying this. Okay, now a pseudocode way of saying it was while there is a record, while not end-of-file. This is analogous to saying this. So when we're reading from a file, we're typically going to set our while test to look like this. So tell me what this means again, while in file. While not end of file. While not end of file. That's it's the file handle, right? So I've opened in file, you know, I've declared it to be IF stream, I've done the open, la la la. very C specific, so I'm not too worried about that. But your loop is going to look like while in file. And this is step 2. I'm going to show you step 1 in a second. This means so long as there's a record in the file, this loop will keep going. When it reaches end of file, this will exit this loop. Okay, so let's say I'm reading temperatures from the file. What's my step 1? What's my start step for this loop? To read a temperature. Yeah. Okay, so I've opened. Don't get hung up on the open. You do not need to, we will do this in lab once. You don't need to do this for the homework, okay, because I'm avoiding the very language-specific stuff. But you will need to do your first read from the file, okay? Now, why did I choose a while loop for this? Why did I choose a while? Here, I've got this on the slide, too. Why did I choose a while loop to read from a file? Let's see who can answer this. What's the deal on the while loop again? Ryan? Correct. And what's unique about the while versus the do while? And so it could have none, right? Remember, is that what you're going to say too? That so the while loop has a minimum of 0 times. Well, I don't get it. What would make me quit this loop right away? Empty file, which is totally possible. Empty file is possible. So if it reads from the file and it's empty, my loop works fine. Okay? So that's why I use a while. Okay, so let's put the framework. So this reads the first guy, the first record. This is my loop condition always for a loop. Here's whatever I'm asking you to do. We'll do some different practices. What's my step 4 or restart step? And that's it. What's that? So right, so it's the same. So this means, this example means that I have an input file. I want to show you what, let's go to the compiler a second. Have an input file that looks like this. You know, a temperature of 100, a temperature of 98.6, a temperature of 77, 56, 88, So this would read in the 100. It would say not end of file, do whatever. This would read in the 98.6, not end of file, do whatever. Read in the 77, What about if I want to be able to read in a city name and a temperature? First of all, how do I change the file? So now how do I change the code? How would I don't have the code here, let's see. Whoops. Okay, so if I'm going to do in file, what would my in file look like in order to read this? So each read statement would have to include both, you know, so in other words, whatever my data looks like, that's what my read statement looks like. Okay? So all we've really changed is we've learned a new framework, and it's actually a relatively simple one if you forget the opening of the file. Okay? We simply, our test condition is always going to be while in file, which in English means so long as there's a record, while not end of file, et cetera, et cetera. We do the first read, and we do the next read here, and then everything else is the same in between, whatever we've done in the past. Okay? And we'll do some prep. So here's just another example. Trying to get over the screen. In this particular example, I've assumed I've opened the file. Okay? I'm reading in the first blood pressure. And I total the blood pressure. What do we call this type of variable again? Accumulator. I've added all the blood pressures. I read in the next one. I come back up to make sure it wasn't end of file. If it wasn't end of file, I add that new guy in. When I'm all done, I print the total.